There's nothing quite like the bond between a woman and the dog who's been her faithful companion through life's hardest seasons. For Iris Thompson, a 40-year-old mountain woman living alone in the Colorado Rockies, her German shepherd Luna has been more than a pet. She's been family, protector and trusted friend through 20 years of solitude. So when Luna goes into labor on a snowy February night, Iris settles in beside her with blankets and warm milk, ready to welcome a new generation. But as 15 tiny coal-black creatures emerge, something feels terribly wrong. Their movements are too smooth, too predatory. Their cries echo through the cabin with a wildness that chills her bones. When the smallest one opens amber eyes that gleam with ancient intelligence and fixes her with a stare that seems far too knowing, Iris realizes the impossible truth. These aren't puppies because they're not look like a dog. But how could this happen in wilderness where no such an animal looked like that have walked for over a century? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the pine trees like old memories. Reluctant to let go of the night, Iris Thompson stood at her kitchen window, cradling a cup of black coffee that steamed against the October chill. At 40, she had the weathered hands of someone who had spent decades coaxing life from stubborn mountain soil and the steady gaze of a woman who had learned to find peace in solitude. Her cabin sat nestled in a grove of aspens at 8,000 feet, accessible only by a winding dirt road that most folks gave up on after the first winter storm. She preferred it that way. The isolation that might drive others to madness had become her sanctuary, especially in the 3 years since Harold's passing. Luna, her 5-year-old German shepherd, padded across the wooden floor with the careful gait of late pregnancy. The dog's belly hung low and heavy, her breathing slightly labored as she settled onto the braided rug near the stone fireplace. Iris had been expecting the birth any day now, though something about Luna's condition had been troubling her for weeks. "Easy. Oh, girl," Iris murmured, setting down her coffee to scratch behind Luna's ears. The dog's eyes held an unusual intensity lately, almost as if she were listening to sounds Iris couldn't hear. The cabin itself was a testament to Harold's craftsmanship and Iris's practical nature. Hand-hewn beams supported a roof that had weathered 40 Colorado winters, while the walls held decades of accumulated wisdom, shelves lined with field guides, herb-drying racks and Harold's collection of hand tools that Iris still used daily. In the corner sat her grandmother's leather-bound journal, its pages filled with careful observations about mountain weather, plant cycles, and the occasional odd notation about shadow, creatures, and old warnings that Iris had always attributed to frontier. Superstition. Harold Thompson had been a forest ranger for 32 years before retirement, brought them permanently to the mountain. He'd chosen this spot not just for its beauty, but for its wildlife corridor, a natural pathway that deer, elk, and the occasional mountain lion used to move between seasonal feeding grounds. "Animals know things we've forgotten," he used to say, watching elk graze in the meadow below their cabin. They remember the old ways. Their marriage had been built on shared silence as much as conversation, comfortable mornings where the only sounds were coffee percolating and pages turning. Harold read field guides and weather reports. Iris preferred journals and letters from her sister in Denver. They'd planned to travel once he retired fully, maybe visit Alaska or take that trip to Yellowstone they'd always talked about. Cancer had other plans. Now, 3 years later, Iris had settled into rhythms that honored both solitude and memory. She rose with the sun, tended her small vegetable garden through the growing season, split wood for winter, and maintained the cabin with the same attention Harold had shown. Luna had been his final gift to her, a puppy from a ranger colleague whose dog had an unexpected litter. "She'll keep you company," he'd said from his hospital bed, already growing thin. Shepherds are loyal that way. Luna had indeed proven faithful, though recently her behavior had grown strange. For the past month, she'd taken to staring into the forest for long stretches, her ears pricked forward as if tracking something Iris couldn't detect. Several times, Iris had followed Luna's gaze and seen nothing but the familiar dance of light and shadow between the trees. Yet Luna would remain alert, sometimes whimpering softly, sometimes growing still with the focused attention of a hunter. The pregnancy itself had been a mystery. Iris kept Luna close to the cabin and hadn't seen any male dogs in the area for months. The nearest neighbor, Joe Brennan, lived 2 miles down the mountain with his ancient beagle, hardly a candidate for fathering Luna's litter. There were rumors of a pack of feral dogs somewhere in the national forest, but rangers would have dealt with that problem quickly. Maybe a coyote, Iris had mused to herself, though the idea troubled her. Coy-dog hybrids were possible but rare, and usually the result of desperate circumstances rather than natural attraction. Luna was well fed and healthy, with no reason to wander far from home seeking companionship. The veterinarian in Pine Ridge, Dr. Peterson, had examined Luna 6 weeks ago and declared everything normal. Strong heartbeats, he'd said, running the ultrasound wand across Luna's belly. I count at least 12, maybe 15 pups. That's a large litter, but shepherds can handle it. Just make sure she has a quiet place to whelp and plenty of fresh water. Iris had prepared accordingly, setting up the old wooden birth box in the cabin's back room. The box had belonged to Harold's grandmother, used for decades to help farm dogs bring new life into the world. Its worn pine boards had witnessed countless births, and Iris had lined it with clean blankets and placed it away from the main living area where Luna could have privacy. But as Luna's time approached, Iris found herself growing increasingly uneasy. The dog's behavior continued to puzzle her. Long periods of staring into the forest, unusual dietary preferences, and an almost human-like expression in her eyes that seemed to hold secrets. Several times, Iris had caught Luna sitting perfectly still in the moonlight, her profile silhouetted against the window like a statue carved from shadow. The morning of the birth had begun like any other, with coffee and quiet contemplation of the mountain landscape. But as Iris watched Luna pace restlessly around the cabin, stopping occasionally to stare towards the tree line, she couldn't shake the feeling that something significant was about to change. Not just the arrival of puppies, but something deeper, something that would challenge everything she thought she understood about her simple mountain life. Outside, the October wind stirred the aspen leaves into whispered conversations, and somewhere in the distance, a sound echoed through the forest that wasn't quite a howl and wasn't quite a cry. Luna lifted her head at the sound, her ears forward and her expression suddenly alert with recognition. "What is it, girl?" Iris asked, but Luna had already turned toward the back room, her steps purposeful and sure. The time had come, and whatever was about to be born into their quiet mountain world would soon reveal whether Iris's growing unease had been merely the imagination of a woman too long alone, or something far more profound than 15 ordinary puppies. The contractions began at dawn, pulling Luna from restless sleep with soft whimpers that brought Iris instantly alert. She had dozed in the rocking chair beside the prepared birthing area, her body attuned to the rhythms of the mountain and the needs of her faithful companion. The first pale light of October was filtering through the cabin windows when Luna rose carefully and padded toward the wooden birth box with purposeful determination. "It's time, isn't it, girl?" Iris murmured, setting aside her coffee cup to kneel beside the box. She had assisted with farm births during her younger years in the valley, back when her family raised cattle, and she understood the sacred nature of bringing life into the world. The wooden box itself carried that history, pine boards worn smooth by Harold's grandmother, who had used it for decades to help farm dogs whelp their litters safely. Luna circled the box twice, her breathing becoming more labored as the contractions intensified. She was a strong, healthy dog at 5 years old, well-nourished and cared for, with no reason to expect complications. Yet something in her behavior struck Iris as unusual, not the normal restless pacing of labor. but an alertness that suggested she was listening to sounds beyond human hearing. The emergency veterinary kit sat ready on the nearby shelf. Clean towels, antiseptic solution, scissors for cutting umbilical cords, and the basic supplies Harold had assembled for situations when professional help was hours away. Iris pulled the rocking chair closer and settled in to provide the quiet companionship that had always been her role in such moments. The first puppy arrived just after 6 in the morning, as golden sunlight touched the eastern peaks, visible through the cabin's windows. Luna worked with the focused efficiency of healthy instinct, cleaning the newborn and guiding it toward warmth. But even in that initial moment, Iris felt a flutter of unease she couldn't quite name. The puppy was larger than she had expected, robust and well-formed, with a coat that seemed unusually dark for a German shepherd. Not the typical brown and tan coloring Luna carried, nor the solid black that sometimes appeared in the breed, but something deeper, a glossy darkness that seemed to absorb the morning light rather than reflect it. "Hello, little one," Iris whispered, watching the newborn's surprisingly coordinated movements. Most puppies emerged helpless and blind, unable to do more than nurse and sleep for their first weeks of life. This one moved with purpose that seemed advanced for a creature hours old. The second puppy followed within 20 minutes, bearing the same striking dark coat and unusual vigor. Luna attended to both with methodical care, but Iris noticed something different in the dog's demeanor. Instead of the exhausted relief most mothers showed between births, Luna remained alert. Her ears pricked forward, as if monitoring the forest beyond the cabin walls. By mid-morning, 6 puppies had joined the world, each one identical in their midnight coloring and remarkable size. Iris found herself counting obsessively, remembering Dr. Peterson's ultrasound prediction of 15. The veterinary kit seemed suddenly inadequate for circumstances that were departing from normal parameters with each new arrival. The 7th puppy brought the first undeniable sign that something extraordinary was happening. When Iris leaned closer to examine the newborn, she saw that its eyes were already open, a development that shouldn't occur for at least 10 days. The eyes themselves were unlike any she had seen in domestic dogs, golden, intense, and holding an awareness that belonged to much older animals. "That's not possible," she murmured. But the evidence lay nursing peacefully against Luna's belly. The puppy's ears, instead of being folded flat against its head, were already alert and properly shaped. Its movements showed coordination that defied everything she knew about newborn development. The 8th through 12th puppies arrived throughout the afternoon, each one challenging Iris's understanding of normal canine birth. Their cries were unlike typical puppy whimpers, higher, more melodic, carrying tones that seemed almost conversational. Luna responded to these sounds with soft rumbles in her chest, as if engaging in dialogue with her impossible offspring. Iris found herself documenting everything in a notebook she kept for unusual observations, though she doubted anyone would believe what she was recording. The puppy's accelerated development continued throughout the day. By evening they were moving with fluid grace, their tiny claws already showing the sharp definition she associated with hunting cats rather than domestic dogs. The 13th and 14th puppies emerged as darkness settled over the mountain, their births accompanied by sounds from the forest that Luna seemed to recognize, but that Iris couldn't identify. Not quite howls, not quite cries, but vocalizations that seemed to welcome the newcomers into a world larger than the cabin's wooden walls. The final puppy arrived at 9:43 in the evening, completing the litter exactly as Dr. Peterson had predicted. But as Luna cleaned this last newcomer, Iris finally confronted what her rational mind had been rejecting all day. These were not puppies in any meaningful sense of the word. The confirmation came when the newest arrival lifted its tiny head and looked directly at her with golden eyes that held intelligence no domestic dog possessed. The creature's facial structure, though small and undeveloped, showed the distinctive features of a feline predator, delicate bone architecture, triangular ears already properly positioned, and whiskers visible as fine white lines against dark fur. When one of the larger newborns stretched a tiny paw, Iris saw retractable claws that gleamed like ivory needles. No dog in the world possessed retractable claws. Whatever Luna had given birth to, they were not members of the canine family. "My God," she whispered, sinking back into the rocking chair with trembling hands. "What are you?" Luna looked up at her with an expression that seemed to hold both apology and explanation, as if the German shepherd understood the impossibility of what had occurred and was asking for understanding rather than judgment. The dog's eyes reflected an intelligence that transcended normal animal awareness, suggesting she was as surprised by these developments as Iris herself. The 15 newborns, she could no longer pretend they were puppies, settled into peaceful nursing, their strange cries subsiding into soft purring sounds that definitely belonged to the feline rather than canine family. Luna relaxed for the first time since labor began, but her ears remained alert to sounds beyond Iris's perception. As midnight approached, Iris made a decision that would define everything that followed. She would tell no one about what had happened in her cabin tonight. Whatever these creatures were, wherever they had come from, they were now her responsibility. The world was full of people who would see them as curiosities, threats or opportunities for exploitation, but she saw them as Luna's children first and mysteries second. The veterinary kit on the shelf seemed suddenly irrelevant, designed for problems that existed within normal parameters. What she was witnessing fell outside every category her experience had prepared her to handle. Yet the evidence was undeniable. 15 black cubs nursing from a German shepherd, their golden eyes reflecting intelligence that belonged to no domestic animal she had ever known. She turned off the overhead light and settled back into the rocking chair for what she knew would be a sleepless night of watching over this impossible family. Outside, the October wind carried sounds that might have been ordinary forest noises or might have been something else entirely. Ancient voices welcoming 15 new mysteries into a world that was about to prove far stranger than she had ever imagined. Dawn arrived with the soft grey light that filtered through October clouds, carrying with it the disorienting realization that the previous night's impossible births had been no dream. Iris woke in Harold's rocking chair, her neck stiff from an uncomfortable night of vigilant watching, to find 15 pairs of golden eyes tracking her movement with unnerving intelligence. She reached for Harold's hand-carved walking stick, its familiar weight providing comfort that felt essential in a world suddenly turned mysterious. The oak staff had supported her husband through countless forest surveys during his ranger days, and now it steadied her as she approached the wooden birth box to assess what daylight would reveal about her impossible charges. "Good morning," she whispered. Though addressing creatures that shouldn't understand human speech felt both natural and absurd, yet something in their collective gaze suggested comprehension that transcended normal animal awareness. The cubs had grown visibly larger overnight, a development that defied everything. She knew about mammalian growth rates. What had been palm-sized newborns were now approaching the size of month-old kittens, their movements coordinated in ways that belonged to much older animals. Their midnight coats had developed a lustrous quality that seemed to shimmer with its own inner light. Luna lifted her head in greeting, tail wagging weakly as exhaustion from nursing such a demanding litter took its toll. The German shepherd's condition had become Iris's primary concern. She was losing weight despite eating increased portions, and her coat was beginning to lose the healthy shine that had always marked her vitality. Iris moved to the kitchen to prepare coffee, needing the familiar ritual to anchor her thoughts while processing what she'd witnessed. As the water heated, she found herself staring at the forest beyond her window, wondering what forces had moved in the darkness to create such impossibilities in her quiet mountain home. Her first instinct was research. She settled at Harold's old desk with her laptop, grateful for the satellite internet connection that maintained her link to the wider world. The searches began simply: unusual dog breeds, large litter sizes, and accelerated puppy Development. The results showed standard canine information that explained nothing about what occupied her back room. Growing more specific, she searched for dog-cat hybrid and impossible crossbreeding. The scientific articles were unambiguous. True hybrids between dogs and cats were genetically impossible due to evolutionary divergence and chromosomal incompatibility. Yet the evidence nursing in her cabin suggested otherwise. A soft cry from the birthing area interrupted her research. She returned to find one of the cubs attempting to climb from the box, its tiny claws gripping the wooden edge with strength that seemed remarkable for its size. The creature moved with the fluid grace of a natural climber, rather than the clumsy fumbling of a newborn puppy. "Oh no, little one," she said gently, lifting the cub back to safety. The moment her hands made contact, she felt warmth that seemed higher than normal body temperature, as if the creature's internal furnace burned more intensely than ordinary mammals. The cub settled back against Luna's belly, but not before looking up at Iris, with what appeared to be gratitude. The morning passed in alternating cycles of research and observation, each activity reinforcing her growing certainty that normal explanations couldn't account for what was happening in her cabin. By noon, the cubs had demonstrated abilities that no veterinary textbook described, climbing vertical surfaces, moving with silent coordination, and displaying visual acuity that suggested they could see clearly in conditions that should have left newborns helpless. The sound of a truck engine laboring up the mountain road around 2 o'clock sent Iris into mild panic. She quickly closed the laptop and moved to the front window, recognizing Joe Brennan's weathered pickup navigating the final curve to her driveway. His timing couldn't have been worse. Joe was her nearest neighbor and Harold's longtime friend, a retired mining engineer whose periodic visits were motivated by genuine concern for her welfare. His weathered face and practical demeanor had been a source of comfort during the difficult months following Harold's death. But today, his arrival represented a threat to secrets she wasn't ready to share. She quickly closed the door to the back room and met Joe on the front porch, hoping her smile appeared more natural than it felt. Harold's walking stick provided both physical support and psychological comfort as she prepared to navigate questions she couldn't answer honestly. "Afternoon, Iris," Joe said, removing his faded baseball cap with the courtesy that marked his generation. "Thought I'd check how you're managing before this weekend's weather moves in. Radio's predicting early snow." "That's thoughtful of you, Joe. I'm doing well. Just staying busy with preparations." She gestured toward the woodpile Harold had started, and she'd been gradually expanding, hoping to redirect his attention toward mundane concerns. Joe's weathered features showed the kind of attention that came from decades of reading people in challenging circumstances. "Luna have those puppies yet? Last time we talked, you mentioned she was getting close." Iris felt her heart rate accelerate, but she kept her voice steady. "Yes, last night. Everything went smoothly, but they're still very young. Luna's being protective, won't let anyone get too close." The half-truth came easier than expected, containing enough honesty to feel believable. "That's natural for new mothers," Joe agreed. "How many in the litter?" 15, she replied, immediately wondering if she should have chosen a less remarkable number. Joe's eyebrows rose with surprise. 15? That's quite a large litter, even for a shepherd. You might want to call Dr. Peterson. Make sure Luna can handle feeding that many. Sometimes the smaller ones struggle in large litters. I'll definitely consider that. Iris nodded, though calling the veterinarian was the last thing she intended to do. "I appreciate your concern." They chatted for several more minutes about weather patterns and winter preparations, but Iris found concentration difficult. From inside the cabin came faint sounds of the cub's unusual vocalizations, and she found herself speaking more loudly than necessary to mask the noise that didn't belong to any ordinary puppies. Joe noticed her distraction. "Everything all right, Iris? You seem a bit on edge today." "Just tired," she said quickly. "Didn't get much sleep last night with the birthing process and all. You know how it is. After Joe left, promising to return later in the week with firewood, Iris returned to the back room to find several cubs had climbed from the box and were exploring the immediate area with curiosity that far exceeded their supposed age. One had somehow reached Harold's old hunting boots in the corner, while another was investigating the leg of a wooden stool with focused attention. "This isn't normal, is it, Luna?" she asked, and the German Shepherd looked up at her with eyes that seemed to acknowledge the obvious understatement. The cub's dietary requirements became a pressing concern as the day progressed. Luna appeared increasingly exhausted from nursing such a demanding litter, and the cubs' appetites were growing more frequent and urgent. When Iris tried offering puppy formula as a supplement, the cubs rejected it immediately, their tiny faces showing distinct displeasure. On impulse, she tried offering small pieces of raw hamburger she'd been thawing for dinner. The cubs' response was immediate and enthusiastic, their already sharp teeth tearing into the meat with skill that belonged to carnivores rather than omnivorous dogs. Their feeding behavior was precise, efficient, and entirely unlike the clumsy nursing she expected from newborns. "What am I going to tell people?" she asked Luna as she watched the impossible scene. "How do I explain any of this without sounding completely mad?" Luna's response was to move closer and rest her head against Iris's knee, a gesture of trust and companionship that felt like both comfort and responsibility. The German Shepherd's steady presence bridged the gap between the familiar world of domestic animals and the mysterious realm these cubs seemed to inhabit. As evening approached, Iris settled back into the rocking chair with Harold's walking stick across her lap, prepared for another night of watching over charges that challenged everything she thought she knew about the natural world. Outside, the forest seemed more alive than usual, filled with sounds that might have been wind in the trees or might have been something else entirely. Ancient voices welcoming 15 new mysteries into a reality far stranger than she had ever imagined possible. By the third morning, Harold's antique compass had begun its wild spinning, the brass needle circling endlessly as if magnetic north had ceased to exist. Iris held the family heirloom in her weathered hands, watching its desperate search for direction, while 15 impossible cubs nursed. From a German shepherd who had somehow given birth to creatures that defied natural law, the compass had belonged to Harold's grandfather, guiding 3 generations of mountain men through Colorado wilderness with unwavering precision. It had never failed, never hesitated, never shown anything but steady reliability. Now it spun like a child's toy, its needle unable to find purchase in a world where the impossible had taken residence in her back room. The cub's growth rate had accelerated beyond anything Iris could rationalize. In 3 days, they had reached the size of month-old kittens, their features developing with clarity that left no doubt about their true nature. The feline characteristics were unmistakable: pointed ears, graceful proportions, retractable claws, and those unsettling golden eyes that seemed to track everything with predatory intelligence. Luna's condition had become critical. The German Shepherd was losing weight at an alarming rate, despite consuming twice her normal portions. Her glossy coat becoming dull as she struggled to nourish 15 rapidly growing offspring who demanded resources no ordinary litter required. Dark circles had formed under her eyes, and her movements showed the exhaustion of a mother pushed beyond normal limits. "I know, girl," Iris whispered, running her hands through Luna's thinning fur. "This isn't what either of us expected when we prepared for puppies." The breakthrough came when desperation drove Iris to explore sections of her grandmother's leather journal she had previously dismissed as elderly eccentricity. Past the practical entries about weather patterns and garden planning lay pages written in faded ink that spoke of shadow cats and mountain guardians with matter-of-fact certainty that had always puzzled the family. One entry, dated September 1923, made Iris's hands tremble as she read, "The shadow cats return when the mountain faces great danger. Old Thomas Singing Bear told me this would happen before he passed to the spirit world. His grandfather witnessed it once when the mining company tried to blast the sacred stones near Bear Creek. A faithful dog, chosen by ancient spirits, gave birth to guardians that were not dogs at all. Folks said it was impossible, but impossible doesn't mean untrue. The mountain remembers what we choose to forget, and it protects itself through methods we don't understand. Iris read the passage 3 times, her grandmother's precise handwriting blurring as the implications settled over her like a weight. This had happened before. Nearly a century ago, another impossible birth had occurred when industrial interests threatened the mountain's sacred places. The cubs weren't an anomaly. They were part of a pattern that stretched back through generations. She spent the afternoon researching local Native American legends, finding references scattered through historical documents and anthropological studies. The Ute and Arapaho tribes both maintained oral traditions about guardian spirits that took physical form during times of environmental crisis. The stories described shadow panthers that appeared when sacred sites faced destruction, creatures that existed between the spiritual and physical worlds to defend what legal systems couldn't protect. The cubs' behavior supported these ancient accounts. They had begun demonstrating awareness that extended far beyond the cabin's walls, their heads turning in unison towards sounds or movements Iris couldn't detect. Their collective attention would focus on the forest windows, tracking presences she couldn't see, but they clearly recognized. More unsettling was their apparent recognition of her role in their protection. They had begun responding to her presence with what could only be called acknowledgement, their golden eyes following her movements with intelligence that seemed both ancient and purposeful. When she entered their room, 15 heads would turn toward her with synchronized attention that felt like evaluation rather than simple animal recognition. That evening, Luna did something that transformed Iris's understanding of the entire situation. The German shepherd walked to the kitchen door and looked back at Iris with unmistakable urgency, then moved to where Harold's hunting jacket hung on its wooden peg. She nosed the fabric, whined softly, then returned to look at Iris with an expression that seemed to hold complex communication. "You want to go outside?" Iris asked, but Luna's response indicated something more significant than basic needs. The dog returned to the back room, gathered one of the largest cubs gently in her mouth, and came back to the kitchen door with clear intention. Understanding dawned slowly. Luna wanted to take the cubs outside, not for ordinary purposes, but for something that felt ceremonial, important beyond normal animal behavior. Against her better judgment, Iris opened the door and followed Luna into the October evening, the antique compass spinning wildly in her jacket pocket. Luna carried the cub to the forest's edge, about 50 yards from the cabin, where moonlight filtered through the aspen trees into a small natural clearing. She placed the cub carefully on the ground and stepped back, as if presenting an offering to forces hidden in the darkness. What happened next would remain etched in Iris's memory with crystalline clarity. The cub, barely 3 days old, lifted its small head toward the full moon and emitted a sound that transcended normal animal vocalization. Part purr, part howl, entirely otherworldly. The call seemed to resonate through the mountain itself. The forest responded immediately. Every night sound ceased. No wind through leaves, no insects calling, no small creatures moving through undergrowth. The mountain held its breath, listening. Then from somewhere deep in the darkness came an answering call that definitely didn't belong to any animal Iris recognized. Ancient, powerful, and welcoming, it seemed to acknowledge the cub's arrival in this world. Luna retrieved the cub and returned to the cabin, her mission apparently complete. As they walked back across the moonlit clearing, Iris noticed that Harold's compass had stopped spinning and now pointed steadily toward the spot where the ceremony had taken place. The next morning brought Joe Brennan's return, and this time his concern carried sharper edges. "Iris, I've been thinking about Luna's litter," he said without his usual pleasantries. 15 puppies is unusual enough, but I haven't heard normal puppy sounds coming from your place. Usually you can hear a large litter from quite a distance, especially when they're hungry." Iris felt her carefully constructed explanations beginning to unravel. "They're remarkably quiet puppies," she said weakly. "Very well-behaved temperaments." Joe's weathered face showed the skepticism of someone who had helped with enough farm births to recognize when something wasn't right. "Mind if I take a look? I know enough about animal husbandry to tell if Luna needs help. If she's struggling with that large litter, we should get professional assistance." The moment Iris had been dreading had arrived. She couldn't keep the cubs hidden indefinitely, and Joe's concern was genuine and persistent. But revealing the truth meant acknowledging something that challenged everything rational people believed about the natural world. "Joe," she said carefully, choosing her words with the precision of someone walking across thin ice, "what I'm about to show you is going to be difficult to understand. I need you to promise me you'll keep an open mind and remember that some things exist beyond our normal experience." His expression grew serious, the casual concern of a neighbor shifting toward something more focused. "Iris, you're starting to worry me. What exactly is going on here?" She led him through the cabin toward the back room, where Luna lay surrounded by her 15 charges. The cubs had grown even larger overnight, their feline features now unmistakable to anyone with eyes to see. Joe stopped short in the doorway, his face cycling through confusion, disbelief, and something approaching awe. "Those aren't puppies," he said quietly, his voice carrying the tone of someone whose worldview was adjusting to accommodate new possibilities. "No," Iris agreed, feeling relief wash through her at finally sharing the truth. "They're not." Joe studied the cubs for a long moment, his engineering mind clearly struggling to process evidence that defied logical explanation. Finally, he looked at Iris with an expression she couldn't quite read. "How long have you known?" "Since the moment they were born," she admitted. "Joe, I know this sounds impossible, but I think something significant is happening here. Something connected to the old stories about this mountain and the forces that protect it." To her surprise, Joe nodded slowly, his weathered features showing recognition rather than dismissal. "My grandfather used to tell stories," he said thoughtfully. "Things he claimed to witness during his mining days back in the 20s. I always figured they were tall tales meant to entertain grandchildren, but now—" He gestured toward the cubs, who were watching him with collective interest. "Now I'm not so sure what's possible and what isn't." The relief of sharing her impossible secret with someone who could accept it without immediate dismissal was overwhelming, but it also raised new questions that felt both urgent and dangerous. If Joe could acknowledge the supernatural, who else might need to know? And more importantly, what responsibilities came with protecting creatures that seemed to exist outside the normal order of nature? As if sensing the shift in their circumstances, Luna looked up at both humans with an expression that seemed to suggest the real challenges were just beginning. Outside, the October wind carried sounds that might have been ordinary forest activity, or might have been the mountain itself breathing, aware that its guardians had been discovered and were growing stronger with each passing day. The emergency radio crackled to life at 3 in the morning, pulling Iris from uneasy sleep with a burst of static and an impossible sound. What seemed to be voices speaking in a language she'd never heard, accompanied by a rhythmic tapping that matched no Morse code she knew. She fumbled for the volume control, but the mysterious transmission faded as quickly as it had begun, leaving only the soft purring of the cubs from the adjacent room. Joe had returned the next day with a different expression than his usual casual concern. His weathered hands carried a thermos of coffee and a manila folder thick with photocopied documents that looked like they'd been stored in someone's attic for decades. "I spent all night going through my grandfather. His papers," he said, settling into Harold's old chair at the kitchen table. "Papers I hadn't looked at since we cleaned out his house 20 years ago. Iris, there's more to this mountain than either of us realized." He spread the documents across the table, hand-drawn maps, journal entries in faded ink, and what appeared to be official mining survey reports from the early 1900s. One map showed the location of Iris's cabin marked with a symbol that looked disturbingly like a stylized panther, My grandfather was part of a survey team in 1924, Joe explained, pointing to a yellowed photograph of 6 men in mining gear. They were hired by Colorado Mineral Development to assess this entire ridge for copper deposits. But according to these notes, they found something else entirely. The documentation painted a picture of a survey that had started routinely and ended in mystery. The team had discovered a series of natural cave formations containing what the reports described as unusual mineral deposits and geometric stone arrangements suggesting non-natural origin. More intriguingly, they documented several encounters with wildlife behavior that defied explanation. "Look at this entry," Joe said, sliding a journal page toward Iris. September 15th, 1924. The Ute Guide. Thomas Singing Bear refused to enter the cave system today. Claims the stones are sacred and that disturbing them will bring the shadow guardians. Laughed at his superstition until we found the tracks. Cat prints the size of dinner plates, but no adult cats in this region should be that large. Mitchell swears he saw golden eyes watching us from the forest, but no animal when we investigated. Iris felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October morning. The parallels between her grandfather's experience and her current situation were too specific to be coincidental. What happened to the survey? That's where it gets interesting, Joe said, flipping through more pages. The team was supposed to spend 6 weeks mapping the mineral deposits, but they packed up and left after 2 weeks. The final report to the mining company was brief. They claimed the terrain was unsuitable for large-scale extraction and recommended against further development. But look at this. He showed her a page that had been torn from the official report and kept separate. The writing was different, more personal. "We cannot recommend development of this site. The stone formations appear to be part of a larger system that serves purposes we do not understand. The wildlife behavior suggests environmental factors that could prove dangerous to a permanent installation. Some things are better left undisturbed." The cubs had grown noticeably larger even since Joe's first visit, now reaching the size of young house cats. Their movements had become increasingly fluid and coordinated, and their vocalizations more complex. They'd begun demonstrating abilities that Luna certainly hadn't possessed, climbing vertical surfaces with ease, disappearing into shadows with unnerving completeness, and showing night vision that allowed them to navigate the cabin in complete darkness. Luna's recovery had been remarkable once Iris started supplementing the cub's diet with raw meat. The German Shepherd's energy had returned, though her behavior remained protective and alert. She'd taken to positioning herself between the cubs and any visitors, a stance that suggested she understood the need for secrecy better than any ordinary dog should. "Joe," Iris said, studying the documents spread across her table, "do you think the cubs are connected to whatever your grandfather's survey team encountered?" "I think," Joe said slowly, "that this mountain has been trying to protect itself for a very long time, and I think Luna was chosen to help it do that." The conversation was interrupted by unusual sounds from the back room, not the cub's normal purring, but something that sounded almost like conversation. Iris and Joe moved quietly to the doorway and found the cubs arranged in a circle, their heads raised toward each other in what could only be described as a meeting. The sounds they were making carried complex intonations, rising and falling in patterns that suggested meaning beyond simple communication. "They're talking," Joe whispered, and Iris couldn't argue with his assessment, as if aware of their observation. The cubs turned in unison to look at the two humans. Their golden eyes held an intelligence that seemed ancient despite their days of life, and their collective gaze felt like evaluation rather than simple recognition. That afternoon, while Joe helped Iris reinforce the cubs' enclosure, they were interrupted by the sound of helicopters passing overhead. 2 aircraft flew low over the ridge, circling the general area before heading toward the national forest boundary. The cubs' reaction was immediate and dramatic. They froze in perfect synchronization, their heads raised and ears pricked forward with focused attention that belonged to seasoned predators. "Not week-old animals, survey helicopters," Joe said grimly. watching the aircraft disappear over the next ridge. Same type the mining companies use for geological assessment. Luna had moved to the window, her body tense with protective alertness. The cubs gathered around her, their collective attention focused on the direction the helicopters had taken. For several minutes after the sound faded, they remained motionless, as if listening to communications beyond human perception. The emergency radio crackled again that evening. This time, picking up fragments of what sounded like radio chatter between ground teams and aircraft. The signals came in bursts, too fragmented to understand clearly. But Iris caught references to geological anomalies and environmental impact assessment. "They're coming back," she said to Joe as they sat at the kitchen table, the cubs' unusual purring creating a soundtrack to their conversation. "Whatever your grandfather's team found in 1924. Someone else knows about it now," Joe nodded, his face reflecting the same mixture of wonder and concern that had been Iris's constant companion since the births. "The question is whether they know about the Guardians yet," as if responding to his words. The largest of the cubs, one Iris had begun thinking of as the leader, padded into the kitchen and sat directly in front of them. Its golden eyes moved between the two humans with unmistakable intelligence. And when it opened its mouth, the sound that emerged was definitely not a meow or a bark, but something that sounded almost like speech, I think, Iris said softly. "They understand more than we realize." The cub maintained eye contact for another moment, then returned to its siblings, leaving Iris and Joe with the growing certainty that whatever was happening on their mountain was about to become much more complicated. Outside, the October night carried sounds that might have been ordinary forest activity, or might have been the mountain itself preparing for something that would test the bond between human guardians and their impossible charges. Dr. Maria Santos arrived on a crisp Thursday morning, her battered Subaru navigating the mountain road with the confidence of someone accustomed to reaching remote locations. Iris had spent 3 sleepless nights deciding whether to contact the wildlife biologist, finally concluding that she needed expert advice from someone who might understand the impossible without immediately calling authorities. Joe had recommended Dr. Santos, mentioning her work with unusual wildlife behavior and her reputation for discretion in sensitive environmental matters. What he hadn't mentioned was her interest in cryptozoology, the study of animals whose existence was disputed or unproven. "Thank you for coming," Iris said, meeting the biologist at the cabin door. Dr. Santos was younger than Iris had expected, perhaps 40, with graying brown hair and the direct gaze of someone accustomed to observing details others missed. Joe's phone call was intriguing, Dr. Santos said, accepting a cup of coffee and settling into Harold's chair. He mentioned unusual animal behavior but was deliberately vague about specifics. "In my experience, that usually means something worth investigating. The tribal medicine pouch had been Harold's discovery, found in the cabin's attic during their first winter renovation. Iris had forgotten about it until the cubs began showing signs of distress during their rapid growth phase. The leather pouch contained dried herbs that her research suggested were traditional calming remedies used by local tribes. When she'd scattered small amounts near the cubs' sleeping area, their restless energy had settled into peaceful contentment. "Before I show you anything," Iris said carefully, "I need to know that you'll approach this with scientific objectivity rather than predetermined assumptions about what's possible." Dr. Santos smiled. "I've spent my career studying animal behavior that challenges conventional understanding. I'm more interested in evidence than explanations that fit existing theories." Iris led her to the back room, where the cubs were engaged in what had become their morning routine, a complex series of movements that resembled play but carried the structure of ritual. They moved in coordinated patterns, their actions synchronized in ways that suggested communication beyond normal animal interaction. Dr. Santos stopped in the doorway, her expression shifting from professional interest to amazement. "Those are definitely not dogs," she said quietly. "No," Iris agreed. "They're not. The biologist approached the enclosure slowly, her trained eye cataloguing details. Panthera pardus coloration, but the proportions are wrong for leopards. The facial structure is more consistent with Panthera onca, jaguars, but the size progression doesn't match any known growth patterns. She looked up at Iris. How old did you say they were? 1 week, Iris said. Dr. Santos studied the cubs for several more minutes, watching their coordinated movements with growing fascination. The behavioral complexity is extraordinary. Normal feline development doesn't support this level of social organization at this age. She paused, then asked the question Iris had been dreading. What's the mother? When Iris brought Luna into the room, Dr. Santos's scientific composure finally cracked. A German shepherd, she said more to herself than to Iris. This is biologically impossible. I know, Iris said. But here they are. The afternoon was spent documenting everything Dr. Santos could observe without disturbing the cubs. She photographed their movements, recorded their vocalizations, and took detailed measurements that she promised to keep confidential. More importantly, she listened to Iris's account of the birth and the strange phenomena that had accompanied it. I've heard stories, Dr. Santos said, as they reviewed her initial findings. Indigenous accounts of spirit animals that appear during times of environmental crisis. Most cryptozoologists dismiss them as folklore, but the consistency across different cultures is remarkable. She showed Iris a folder of research she'd brought, academic papers on anomalous animal behavior, documented cases of impossible hybridization, and Native American accounts of guardian spirits taking physical form. One paper, published in a fringe biology journal, described similar phenomena occurring near sites of proposed environmental destruction. There's a pattern, Dr. Santos explained. These events seem to cluster around locations where industrial development threatens areas considered sacred by indigenous peoples. The animals that appear consistently show supernatural characteristics, accelerated development, unusual intelligence, and abilities that exceed normal biological parameters. The cubs had been watching Dr. Santos throughout her visit with collective interest that went beyond normal animal curiosity. When she knelt near their enclosure to take photographs, the largest cub approached the barrier and placed its paw against the mesh where her hand rested on the other side. The contact seemed to communicate something neither human could understand, but Dr. Santos's expression suggested she recognized its significance. They're evaluating you, Iris said. They do that with everyone who comes near them. And what conclusion do you think they've reached? Dr. Santos asked. Before Iris could answer, her attention was drawn to movement outside the window. A line of survey trucks was visible on the ridge road, heading toward the national forest boundary. The vehicles flew flags that identified them as environmental assessment teams, but their presence felt more invasive than protective. The cubs' reaction was immediate and coordinated. They moved to the side of their enclosure closest to the window, their bodies tense with alert attention. The largest cub began a low vocalization that the others picked up, creating a harmony that resonated through the cabin's wooden walls. They sensed the threat, Dr. Santos observed. The question is whether the threat is to them specifically or to something larger they're meant to protect. That evening, after Dr. Santos had left with promises to research similar cases and return within the week, Iris and Joe discovered the answer to that question. While checking on the cubs before bed, Iris noticed that Harold's antique compass was spinning again, but this time with a different pattern. Instead of random rotation, it was pointing steadily toward the forest, toward something specific in the darkness beyond the trees. There's something out there, she said to Joe, something the cubs are connected to. Following the compass's direction, they found a path they'd never noticed before, barely visible among the aspens. The trail led deeper into the forest than either of them had ever explored, winding between ancient trees toward what appeared to be a clearing in the distance. We should wait until daylight, Joe said. But even as he spoke, they could hear the cubs calling from the cabin. their voices carrying urgent communication that seemed to be guiding them forward. The path led to a circle of standing stones, each one carved with symbols that predated any known local culture. At the circle's center lay a depression in the earth, filled with what appeared to be natural spring water that reflected the moonlight like polished obsidian. The compass pointed directly at the central stone, and around the circle's perimeter, golden eyes watched from the shadows, not the cubs, but something larger, older, and infinitely more mysterious. "Guardian spirits," Joe whispered, and Iris knew he was right. Whatever the cubs were becoming, whatever ancient covenant they represented, it was centered here in this sacred place that development crews would soon threaten. The mountain had been preparing for this confrontation for nearly a century, and Luna's impossible litter was only the beginning of something that would soon demand everything Iris had to give. The corporate survey maps spread across Iris's kitchen table told a story that reframed everything she thought. She understood about the cub's arrival. Dr. Santos had returned 3 days early, her face grim with discoveries that made the impossible seem inevitable. "Blackstone Development," she said, pointing to the logo on the official documents. "They filed preliminary mining permits 6 months ago, exactly when Luna would have conceived. The timeline was too precise to be coincidental. According to the survey reports, Blackstone intended to extract rare earth minerals from a deposit that ran directly beneath the sacred stone circle. The mining operation would require blasting through the natural cave system and redirecting the underground spring that fed the ceremonial pool. "They want to destroy the heart of the mountain," Joe said, studying the proposed excavation plans. "Everything our grandfathers warned about. But the revelation that transformed Iris's understanding came from Dr. Santos's research into the cub's impossible genetics. Laboratory analysis of fur samples she'd collected revealed something that challenged every principle of mammalian biology. The DNA sequencing shows genetic markers from multiple species," Dr. Santos explained, her scientific training clearly struggling with the implications. "Not just dog and panther, but genetic signatures that don't match any known animal. There are sequences in their DNA that appear to be artificially integrated, as if their genetic code was designed rather than evolved. The samples had revealed other anomalies, cellular regeneration rates that exceeded normal healing by factors of 10, neural development patterns that suggested intelligence processing capabilities beyond current understanding, and metabolic efficiency that allowed them to derive energy from sources other than conventional nutrition." "What are you saying?" Iris asked, though she suspected the answer would challenge her worldview even further. "I'm saying," Dr. Santos said carefully, "that these cubs represent a biological impossibility that can only be explained by forces beyond our current scientific understanding. They weren't conceived through normal reproduction, they were created." The true nature of Luna's role became clear through Dr. Santos's interviews with tribal elders. Thomas Singing Bear's great-grandson, now in his 80s, had been waiting for someone to ask the right questions for decades. "My great-grandfather told stories about the Guardian Compact," he'd explained to Dr. Santos. "When the mountain faces destruction, the spirits choose a vessel, always a faithful companion, never a wild animal, to bring guardians into the physical world. The vessel gives willingly, knowing the sacrifice required. Luna hadn't mated with any earthly creature. She had been selected by ancient forces as a bridge between the spiritual and physical realms, chosen for her loyalty, her bond with Iris, and her proximity to the threatened sacred sites. The cubs were spirit guardians made flesh, ancient protectors given physical form to defend what legal and political processes couldn't protect. That's why the compass spins around them, Joe realized. They exist partially outside normal space. They're anchored to this dimension, but connected to something else entirely. The corporate survey maps revealed the full scope of Blackstone's intentions. The mining operation was planned in 3 phases, beginning with preliminary excavation that would commence within 2 weeks. The first phase alone would destroy half the sacred circle and contaminate the spring water with industrial runoff. They must know about the spiritual significance, Dr. Santos said, pointing to notations on the margins of the surveys. Look at these references: geological anomalies requiring special handling and environmental factors necessitating modified extraction procedures. They know they're destroying something important. The cubs' accelerated development made sense within this context. They were maturing rapidly because time was running out. The spiritual forces that had created them understood the timetable for destruction and had calibrated their guardians' growth to meet the threat. That evening, as if sensing the gravity of what the humans had discovered, the cubs demonstrated abilities that left no doubt about their supernatural nature. The largest cub, the one Iris had been thinking of as the leader, approached the barrier of their enclosure and simply walked through the wire mesh as if it weren't there. Not over it or under it, but through it, its body seeming to exist in spaces that normal matter couldn't occupy. The other cubs followed, each one passing through solid barriers with the fluid grace of creatures unbound by conventional physics. They gathered around Iris, Luna, Joe, and Dr. Santos, their golden eyes reflecting intelligence that seemed ancient and purposeful. "They're showing us what they can do," Iris said. "They're preparing us for what's coming." The revelation reached its climax when the cubs began to demonstrate their connection to the mountain itself. Moving as one coordinated unit, they arranged themselves in a circle around the humans and began vocalizing in harmony. The sound they created resonated through the cabin's wooden structure, and suddenly Iris could feel what they were feeling: the mountain's distress, the threat approaching like a wound about to be opened, and the determination of forces older than human civilization to prevent that destruction. "My God," Dr. Santos whispered. "They're not just guardians. They're the mountain's voice made manifest." The sacred stone circle wasn't just a ceremonial site, it was a focal point for spiritual energies that maintained the balance of the entire ecosystem. The underground spring wasn't merely water, but a conduit for forces that sustained life throughout the region. Blackstone Development wasn't just planning to mine minerals. They were planning to sever connections that had existed for millennia. The spirits didn't create the cubs to fight the mining operation, Iris realized. They created them to save the mountain's soul. Luna's recovery made perfect sense now. Her role as vessel had been completed successfully, and her health returned as a sign of the spirit's gratitude. But her protective behavior toward the cubs continued because she understood their importance in ways that transcended normal canine instincts. As the evening deepened, Iris found herself facing a choice that would define everything that followed. The cubs needed protection while they completed their maturation. But the corporate timeline meant that protection would soon require direct confrontation with forces that viewed the mountain as nothing more than a resource to be exploited. "How long do we have?" she asked Dr. Santos. "According to the permits, Blackstone begins site preparation Monday morning," came the reply. 4 days. 4 days to prepare for a confrontation between ancient spiritual guardians and modern corporate power. 4 days to protect creatures that existed partially outside normal reality. 4 days to save a mountain that had been protecting itself through guardians for longer than human memory could recall. The cubs looked up at Iris with golden eyes that seemed to hold both trust and expectation. They had been created for this purpose, but they were still young, still developing the abilities they would need for the task ahead. The question was whether she, Joe, Dr. Santos, and Luna could provide enough protection and guidance to see them through to their full power. Outside, the October wind carried sounds that might have been approaching machinery, or might have been the mountain itself breathing, aware that its guardians were almost ready and its enemies were already moving. The sacred stone circle revealed its full power on Sunday evening, just hours before Blackstone Development was scheduled to begin their assault on the mountain. Iris stood at the edge of the ancient formation, watching the cubs arrange themselves around the central spring with the precision of a ritual performed countless times across centuries. The cubs had grown to the size of young panthers, their movements fluid and powerful, their golden eyes holding intelligence that seemed to encompass not just their brief lives but generations of guardianship. They positioned themselves at specific stones, each one corresponding to what Dr. Santos had identified as cardinal directions, seasonal markers, and celestial alignments that connected the circle to larger cosmic patterns. They know exactly what they're doing, Dr. Santos whispered from her position at the circle's edge. She'd spent the weekend documenting everything, creating a record of events that would either be dismissed as elaborate fiction or recognized as proof that the world contained mysteries science had barely begun to understand. Luna lay near the central spring, her role as vessel complete, but her protective instincts still strong. The German shepherd's presence seemed to anchor the cubs to the physical world, preventing them from slipping entirely into whatever spiritual dimension had created them. Joe had returned from town with troubling news. "The Blackstone convoy is staging at the Forest Service Road," he reported. 12 vehicles, including excavation equipment and what looks like private security. They're planning to start at dawn. The cubs' response to this information was immediate. The largest, the leader Iris had begun thinking of as guardian, lifted its head toward the approaching threat and emitted a sound that was part roar, part song, and entirely otherworldly. The other cubs responded in harmony, their voices creating resonances that seemed to awaken something deep within the mountain itself. "They're calling for help," Iris realized. "Not from us, but from whatever created them." The answer came as darkness settled over the forest. Golden eyes appeared among the trees, not reflections, but sources of light that moved with purpose and intelligence. The adult guardians, the spiritual entities that had protected this mountain for generations, were responding to their newly incarnated offspring. "How many are there?" Dr. Santos asked, her voice barely audible. "I count at least 20, Joe replied, though the lights seemed to shift and multiply in ways that made accurate counting impossible. Maybe more. The cubs had completed their preparation. They moved from the stones to form a protective circle around the spring, their bodies poised for action that would either save their sacred ground or die in its defense. But Iris could see they were still young, still developing the abilities they would need for the confrontation ahead. "They need more time," she said to Joe. "Maybe another week to reach full strength." "Time we don't have," Joe replied grimly. "Blackstone starts digging at sunrise." The solution came from an unexpected source. Dr. Santos had been in contact with environmental groups throughout the weekend, sharing carefully edited versions of her discoveries. The unusual wildlife behavior and presence of previously undocumented species provided legal grounds for emergency environmental protection. "Orders. I've been working with the Sierra Club and the Native American Environmental Network," she explained. "If we can document the cubs' existence and their connection to this site, we can get a temporary injunction to halt the mining operation." But documentation meant exposure, and exposure meant bringing the outside world into contact with mysteries it wasn't prepared to understand. The cubs seemed to recognize this dilemma. Guardian approached Iris directly, its golden eyes meeting hers with unmistakable communication. In that moment of contact, Iris experienced something beyond normal sensation. She felt the mountain's perspective, millennia of seasonal cycles, generations of wildlife, the slow dance of geological change, and the recent violent intrusion of industrial development. She felt the Guardian's purpose, not just to protect sacred sites, but to maintain the balance between human progress and natural harmony. "They're willing to reveal themselves," she told the others, "but only if we can guarantee their protection afterward." The night became a series of careful preparations and difficult decisions. Dr. Santos prepared documentation that would establish the cubs as a previously unknown species, requiring immediate protection. Joe coordinated with tribal elders to provide historical context for the site's spiritual significance. Iris prepared to transform from a private mountain woman into a public advocate for forces most people would dismiss as impossible. The cubs demonstrated abilities that would soon shock the scientific community. They showed Dr. Santos how they could manipulate their physical density, moving through solid matter when necessary, but maintaining normal interaction with their environment when desired. They displayed telepathic communication, not just among themselves, but with the adult guardians still watching from the forest. Most remarkably, they showed her their connection to the mountain's ecosystem. When Guardian placed its paw in the sacred spring, the water began to glow with bioluminescence that revealed the underground network connecting this site to springs, streams, and groundwater throughout the region. The cubs weren't just protecting a ceremonial circle. They were protecting the water system that sustained life across hundreds of square miles. This changes everything, Dr. Santos said, documenting the phenomenon. If Blackstone destroys this site, they'll contaminate water sources for communities throughout the valley. As dawn approached, the final pieces of their desperate strategy fell into place. Environmental lawyers were standing by with emergency injunctions. Media contacts were prepared to document whatever happened at the sacred circle. Tribal representatives were traveling from 3 reservations to provide testimony about the site's cultural significance. But the cubs' behavior suggested they were preparing for something more direct than legal battles. They moved through practice sequences that looked like coordination for physical confrontation, their movements demonstrating fighting skills that no animals their age should possess. "They're ready to defend this place," Iris said, watching Guardian lead the others through what could only be described as military drills. "The question is whether we're ready to support them." The sound of heavy machinery starting up echoed across the forest just as the eastern sky began to lighten. Blackstone Development was beginning their operation exactly on schedule, unaware that they were about to encounter opposition that existed outside every category their security teams had been trained to handle. Luna rose from her position near the spring and looked at Iris with an expression that managed to convey both determination and farewell. The German shepherd understood that what was about to happen would change everything, and she was prepared to face whatever consequences followed. The cubs arranged themselves in formation around the sacred circle, their golden eyes reflecting the first rays of sunrise. They had grown as much as they could in the time available, developed their abilities as far as possible given the constraints. Now they would discover whether spiritual guardianship could prevail against industrial determination. "Are you ready?" Guardian seemed to ask Iris, its gaze holding hers with intensity that felt like a covenant being sealed. "We're ready," she replied, speaking for herself, Joe, Dr. Santos, Luna, and the mountain itself. Whatever happened next would determine not just the fate of 15 impossible cubs, but the balance between ancient wisdom and modern progress that would define the mountain's future for generations to come. The sound of approaching bulldozers grew louder, and in the distance Iris could see the first Blackstone vehicles making their way up the forest road. The confrontation that had been building for nearly a century was about to begin, and she found herself standing at the center of forces that would soon test everything she believed about the possible. The sacred and the price of protection. The first bulldozer reached the edge of the sacred grove at 6:47 a.m., its diesel engine shattering the mountain silence like a declaration of war. Iris stood at the stone circle's perimeter, her emergency flare gun loaded and ready, watching as the lead machine pushed through the forest with mechanical indifference to the ancient trees falling in its path. The cubs' response was instantaneous and coordinated. All 15 guardians rose from their positions around the circle, their bodies shifting in ways that defied normal physics. They seemed to grow larger, their forms becoming less solid and more luminous until they appeared as much spirit as flesh. The golden light emanating from their eyes intensified, casting shadows that moved independently of their sources. "Jesus," breathed the bulldozer operator, his voice carrying clearly in the morning air as his machine ground to a halt. "What the hell are those things?" The Blackstone security team had trained for environmental protesters, indigenous activists, and wildlife encounters. They had not trained for supernatural guardians whose very presence caused their radio equipment to emit otherworldly frequencies and their GPS systems to spin wildly before failing completely. Guardian, the largest of the cubs, stepped forward from the circle and fixed its gaze on the lead bulldozer. The machine's engine began to sputter, its hydraulic systems leaking fluid that sparkled with impossible iridescence. The operator tried to restart the engine 3 times before abandoning his position and retreating toward the convoy. "Control. This is Site 1, came a crackling voice over the radio. "We have a situation here. Unknown animals blocking access to the target zone. Request immediate backup." Dr. Santos moved to her prepared position behind one of the largest standing stones, her camera equipment documenting everything, while her emergency radio broadcast on frequencies she'd cleared with environmental groups. "This is Dr. Santos at the protected site," she transmitted. "Blackstone Development is proceeding with excavation despite the presence of endangered species. We need immediate media and legal response." The corporate response was swift and overwhelming. Within minutes, 3 additional vehicles arrived, carrying supervisors who clearly hadn't expected opposition from sources their environmental impact studies hadn't accounted for. A man in an expensive suit emerged from the lead vehicle, his expression shifting from annoyance to confusion as he took in the scene. "I'm Director Harrison from Blackstone Development," he announced through a portable megaphone. "This is private property under legal mineral extraction permits. You're trespassing on an active mining site." Iris stepped forward, her mountain-weathered confidence a stark contrast to his corporate authority. "This is sacred ground protected by federal environmental statutes," she replied, her voice carrying clearly without amplification. "These animals represent a previously undocumented species that requires immediate protection." Harrison's response was to signal his security team toward the stone circle, apparently believing that removing the human protesters would solve his supernatural problem. The cubs' reaction to approaching armed men was both beautiful and terrifying. They moved as one coordinated entity, their forms becoming translucent as they flowed between the stones like liquid shadow. When the security personnel tried to advance past the circle's perimeter, they found themselves unable to proceed, not blocked by physical barriers, but simply incapable of moving forward, as if the space beyond the stones existed in a different dimension. "What kind of technology is this?" Harrison demanded, his corporate composure cracking as he watched his security team struggle against invisible resistance. "Some kind of sonic deterrent system?" Joe emerged from his concealed position near the forest edge, his weathered hands carrying documents that represented decades of family knowledge. "No technology," he said calmly. "Just the mountain protecting itself the way it always has." The flare gun in Iris's hands felt both inadequate and symbolically perfect as she watched the supernatural confrontation unfold. The cubs had demonstrated they could defend their sacred ground, but the corporate response was escalating beyond what even spirit guardians might be able to manage peacefully. "This is Sierra Legal Foundation," came Dr. Santos's radio transmission. "We have documented evidence of federal environmental violations and request immediate injunctive relief. Species protection takes precedence over mining permits." Harrison's face showed the frustration of a man whose straightforward industrial operation had become entangled with forces his MBA hadn't prepared him to handle. He spoke urgently into his satellite phone, presumably coordinating with corporate headquarters and legal teams. The cubs maintained their protective formation around the stone circle, their supernatural abilities creating a barrier that no conventional force could breach. But Iris could see the strain in their coordinated movements. They were still young, still developing, and maintaining their defensive posture against this level of industrial pressure was draining their energy. Luna moved from her position near the central spring to stand beside Iris, the German shepherd's presence bridging the gap between mundane and mystical. Her loyalty to both human and guardian responsibilities had brought them to this moment, and her steady courage would be needed for whatever came next. The sound of approaching helicopters added urgency to an already tense situation. Harrison's reinforcements were arriving by air, bringing heavier equipment and presumably more personnel trained to deal with unconventional obstacles. But the helicopter's engines began experiencing the same mysterious malfunctions that had affected the bulldozers: power fluctuations, navigation failures, and radio interference that suggested the Guardian's influence extended beyond the immediate stone circle. "They can't land," Joe observed, watching the aircraft struggle to maintain stable flight patterns. "The Cubs are protecting the entire area." The morning sun climbed higher, casting shadows that seemed to move independently of their sources, while the confrontation between ancient guardianship and modern industrial power reached a crescendo that would determine the mountain's fate. Iris gripped the flare gun, knowing that the signal it would send might be the only way to alert the outside world to what was happening in this remote, sacred grove. The Cubs looked to her with golden eyes that held both determination and trust, waiting for her signal to either escalate their defense or attempt one final peaceful resolution. The choice would be hers, and whatever she decided would echo through the mountain for generations to come. The emergency flare arced over the stone circle like a crimson prayer, its brilliant light cutting through the morning shadows as it climbed toward the troubled sky. Iris watched its trajectory with the satisfaction of someone who had just sent a message that would be impossible to ignore. The signal that would bring media attention, environmental lawyers, and federal oversight to this remote mountain confrontation. The Cubs responded to the flare as if it were a battle cry. Their supernatural abilities reached full manifestation as they channeled the mountain's spiritual energy through the sacred stones. The air around the circle began to shimmer with heat distortion that had nothing to do with temperature, and the ancient symbols carved into the standing stones began to glow with the same golden light that emanated from the Guardian's eyes. Director Harrison's corporate composure finally shattered completely. "What the hell is happening here?" he shouted into his satellite phone. "I need federal support. We have some kind of terrorist weapon creating electromagnetic interference." But the Cubs' demonstration of power was reaching beyond mere interference. Guardian stepped into the center of the stone circle and placed its paws on Luna's collar, the simple leather band that had become a bridge between the natural and supernatural worlds. The moment of contact created a resonance that spread outward from the sacred spring, following underground water channels and ley lines until the mountain itself seemed to awaken. Every piece of mechanical equipment in the Blackstone convoy began to malfunction simultaneously. Engines seized, hydraulic systems failed, and electronic components sparked with overloads that defied troubleshooting. The corporate invasion force found itself stranded with millions of dollars of useless machinery and no explanation that their insurance companies would accept. "They're not just defending this circle," Dr. Santos realized, documenting the expanding sphere of influence. "They're protecting the entire watershed." The helicopters that had been struggling to land were forced to retreat to safer distances as their navigation systems failed completely. But their cameras were still recording, and Iris knew that footage of supernatural Guardians protecting sacred ground would soon reach audiences far beyond Colorado's mountains. The revelation of the Cubs' true nature reached its climax when the adult Guardians emerged from the forest. 21 full-grown panthers materialized from shadows and morning mist, their golden eyes reflecting intelligence that spanned centuries. They arranged themselves around the outer perimeter of the stone circle, creating a living barrier that no human force could breach. "My God," Harrison whispered, his megaphone forgotten, as he stared at creatures that existed outside every category his corporate worldview could accommodate. They're real. The adult guardians weren't entirely physical. They shimmered between substance and spirit, their forms solid enough to block access, but translucent enough to reveal their supernatural nature. They had been protecting this mountain for generations, appearing whenever threats exceeded what legal and political processes could. Handle Luna's role in the spiritual protocol reached its culmination as she moved to stand between the human defenders and the adult guardians. Her collar, a symbol of domesticity and human partnership, became the focal point for communication between species, realms, and ways of understanding the world. She's translating, Iris realized, watching Luna's careful movements between the groups. She's helping them understand each other. The Blackstone security team had retreated to their vehicles, unwilling to confront supernatural forces their training hadn't prepared them to handle. But their presence was no longer the primary threat. The flare's signal was bringing reinforcements from both sides. Environmental activists, media crews, and federal agents were converging on the mountain, while Blackstone's corporate headquarters was undoubtedly mobilizing legal and political resources to salvage their mining operation. "This is CNN Denver," came a voice over Dr. Santos's emergency radio. "We have helicopters en route to your coordinates. Can you confirm reports of unknown animal species?" "Confirmed," Dr. Santos replied. "Multiple undocumented felids demonstrating protective behavior at sacred site. Environmental protection protocols, in effect." The cubs' supernatural abilities reached their peak as they channeled the mountain's spiritual energy to send a message that transcended species barriers. Guardian lifted its head toward the troubled sky and emitted a sound that was part roar, part song, and entirely otherworldly. The vocalization carried across the valley, reaching communities that had never heard such sounds before. But it also reached something else, the part of human consciousness that remembered when people and animals shared deeper connections. When mountains were recognized as living entities deserving protection, when impossible things were accepted as natural parts of a larger mystery. Harrison's satellite phone was transmitting live feed to Blackstone headquarters, where executives were undoubtedly struggling to explain how a routine mining operation had become a supernatural confrontation with global media implications. The footage of 15 panther cubs defending sacred ground against industrial machinery would soon become viral content, challenging everyone's assumptions about what was possible. The resolution came not through violence, but through revelation. As news crews established positions around the sacred grove, the cubs demonstrated their true purpose. They weren't weapons of environmental warfare. They were teachers, showing humanity what happened when ancient wisdom confronted modern destructive power. The adult guardians began to fade back into the forest, their protective presence no longer needed now that the world was watching. But before disappearing completely, the largest of the spiritual entities approached Iris directly, its golden eyes meeting hers with unmistakable acknowledgement. In that moment of contact, she understood the full scope of what had been accomplished. The cubs would continue growing, continue protecting, but they would no longer bear the burden alone. The mountain had found human allies who understood that some things were more valuable than mineral extraction, more important than corporate profits. Luna's collar caught the morning sunlight as she looked up at Iris with expression that held both satisfaction and continuing devotion. Her role as vessel had been completed successfully, but her role as bridge between worlds would continue as long as the Guardians needed human understanding. "Stand down," Harrison finally ordered his remaining personnel, his corporate authority undermined by forces that no amount of money could purchase or control. "We're withdrawing pending further assessment." The cubs settled back into peaceful formation around the sacred spring, their supernatural display subsiding now that the immediate threat had been neutralized. But their golden eyes remained alert, watchful, ready to respond to whatever challenges would come as the outside world learned about their existence. Spring arrived early on the mountain, and with it came the sound of hammers and saws as workers finished installing the hand-carved wooden sign that would mark this place for generations to come. Iris stood beside the sacred stone circle, watching craftsmen position the weathered pine board that read, "Sacred Mountain Preserve, Protected Wildlife and Spiritual Heritage Site." The words were simple, but they represented a victory that had transformed not just her mountain, but her understanding of what was possible when ancient wisdom confronted modern destructive power. The cubs now, magnificent young panthers approaching their full size, moved through their expanded territory with the confident grace of creatures who had found their purpose in the world. 6 months of growth and training had transformed them from impossible newborns into guardians whose very presence seemed to emanate the mountain's protective spirit. They patrolled boundaries that extended far beyond the original stone circle, their golden eyes alert to threats both seen and unseen. Guardian, the leader who had first demonstrated their supernatural abilities, approached Iris with the fluid movement that still took her breath away. The young panther's coat held depths of black that seemed to contain starlight, and when it looked at her with those ancient eyes, she felt the weight of responsibility that came with being chosen as protector of mysteries most people would never understand. Luna rested in her favorite spot near the sacred spring, her health fully restored and her role in the mountain's protection permanently honored. The German shepherd had become something of a legend among the researchers, journalists, and spiritual pilgrims who visited the preserve. Children especially were drawn to her gentle presence, sensing somehow that this ordinary-looking dog had been vessel for an extraordinary miracle. "The federal recognition papers came through this morning," Dr. Santos announced, approaching from the research station that now occupied a respectful distance from the sacred sites. Her face showed the satisfaction of someone whose life's work had achieved validation beyond her wildest hopes. "The entire watershed is protected under both environmental and religious freedom statutes. The Supreme Court upheld the lower court rulings unanimously. The legal victory had required coordination between constitutional lawyers, tribal representatives, environmental groups, and consciousness researchers who crafted protections, acknowledging that some places held significance beyond economic valuation. The cubs' documented abilities had created new categories of wildlife protection, establishing precedents that recognized guardianship as legitimate animal behavior, deserving federal support." Joe emerged from the forest path, his weathered face showing pride that seemed to encompass generations of his family's connection to this land. At 73, he had become the preserve's unofficial historian, sharing stories about the mountain's spiritual significance with visitors who came seeking connection to forces larger than themselves. "The tribal council approved the cultural center plans," he reported, settling onto the wooden bench Harold had built years ago beside the spring. "Construction starts next month on the old mining road site. Visitors will learn about the traditions before they hike up to see the guardians." The transformation had exceeded everyone's expectations. The cub's existence had attracted attention from around the world, but the mountain had somehow filtered that attention, drawing those who came with respect while discouraging those whose motives were exploitative or sensational. The preserve had become a destination for families teaching their children about mystery, researchers studying consciousness, and people simply seeking proof that the natural world contained wonders worth protecting. Iris settled into her rocking chair, now permanently positioned beside the sacred spring, where she spent her evenings watching the cubs perform their daily rituals. The chair faced west, toward the peaks where Harold had scattered his grandfather's ashes decades ago, and where she planned to rest her own someday. When her role as guardian passed to someone younger, "I never expected to become spokesperson for the impossible," she told Dr. Santos, as they watched the cubs demonstrate their shadow travel abilities for a group of respectful visitors. "Harold always said the mountain chose its own protectors, but I thought he meant in metaphorical terms. Luna's recovery had been complete, though her behavior remained protective of both cubs and humans who showed proper reverence for the sacred sites. The German Shepherd had developed an uncanny ability to evaluate visitors' intentions, guiding appropriate people toward deeper understanding, while steering those with harmful motives back toward the parking area without conflict. The research station operated under protocols that balanced scientific inquiry with spiritual respect. Dr. Santos had assembled a team of biologists, anthropologists, and consciousness researchers who approached the cub's abilities with open minds and careful methodology. Their published papers were creating new fields of study that bridged objective science and subjective spiritual experience, changing how academics thought about the relationship between mind and matter. The cubs had established a network of territories throughout the mountain range, their presence creating protective influence that extended far beyond the original stone circle. They moved between dimensions with the fluid grace of creatures unbound by conventional physics, appearing when needed and fading back into mystery when their immediate work was complete. As afternoon shadows lengthened across the preserve, Iris found herself reflecting on how profoundly her quiet mountain life had changed. The private woman, who had once sought only solitude and simple routine, had become a bridge between worlds, speaking at conferences about environmental protection and testifying before Congress about the need to recognize spiritual relationships with land. The cubs gathered around her chair in their evening ritual, their purring creating harmonies that seemed to resonate through the mountain's stone foundations. Each one had developed distinct personality traits while maintaining their collective purpose. Some showed particular affinity for children, others for researchers, still others for the tribal elders who visited to maintain ceremonial connections with the site. "Thank you," Iris whispered to Luna. To the cubs and to the mountain itself, words that carried gratitude for impossible gifts, for the privilege of witnessing mystery made manifest, and for the responsibility of protecting wonders that connected earth to sky, past to future. Human hearts to the eternal rhythms of the natural world. The wooden sign caught the last rays of sunlight, its carved letters declaring protection that would endure long after current generations had passed into memory. But the real monument to what had been accomplished lived in the golden eyes of 15 guardians who had chosen to make the impossible possible, and in the knowledge that some things were too sacred to surrender to those who measured the world only in terms of extraction and profit. As twilight settled over the protected preserve, Iris found peace in sounds that had become as familiar as her own heartbeat. The soft conversations of cubs planning their nightly patrols, the rustle of adult guardians moving through shadows, and the gentle rhythm of Luna's breathing as she rested beside the spring that connected all living things to the mountain's ancient heart. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new visitors, new questions about how the impossible had become reality in this remote Colorado sanctuary. But tonight, under stars that seemed brighter since the Guardian's arrival, Iris simply sat beside the sacred waters and marveled at how protection and mystery could prevail when people chose wonder over exploitation, guardianship over consumption, and the eternal over the merely profitable.